Greetings, friends. Welcome. Take a seat by the fire. You have traveled far. You have traveled through the barrier between life and death itself. One of my servants has called you here to the great hall of Valhalla, and today we will be discussing a tale connected to it. The tale of Ragnarok, the end of times, the fate of the gods. This, of course, is from Norse mythology, and as many of you will know, it was a big influence on J.R.R. Tolkien and the Lord of the Rings and all of his mythology. And that's very much where my interest comes from. That's how I've got into this subject and been, after reading the Lord of the Rings, wanting to go into read about Ragnarok and the ideas, the values, the somewhat troubling aspect of the story. And to do this today, I have a very special guest, somebody who I'm really pleased to have back on the channel. It is, if I can get him here, NordHugr, aka Matt. Hello, Matt. How are you doing?
Hey Nathan, thank you for having me on. It's always an honor to be here, always a pleasure. This is gonna be a lot of fun. I can't wait.
It's going to be great fun, and I think we were a juicy topic. We were just saying before the show. There's just so many ways we could take this. You could probably fill tens, 20 hours on this subject alone. Probably even more, right?
Oh yeah. I mean, there's so many dimensions, so many characters involved, so many sources. It's very There's so many dimensions to it.
And in part, this stream was inspired because you yourself did a couple of really great videos on this on your YouTube channel.
Thank you. Yeah, I put out the first video, which was just kind of doing an overview of the events as told in the Voluspa, and then did another video kind of diving deeper into the philosophy and what writers have said about Ragnarok, how it parallels with Apocalypse and the Christianization of the Ragnarok myth. So there was a lot within those. I had to break them up into two videos because it was getting so complicated on my
Mm.
editing timeline, and there was so much, like, the script was getting too long, so I broke it up. Yeah, that one was pretty crazy. That took me a huge amount of time to get through, especially on the editing and the voiceover side. But I'm happy with it turned out for the most part, and people seem to like it. But it's still got me thinking, even though it was like an hour plus,
Mhm.
an hour 10 minutes of content in there, there's still so much left to discuss. It's not something that can be encapsulated into just a pre-recorded video, but maybe that's a good primer on the subject if you're not familiar with it at all.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, especially the first video in terms of just laying out the the kind of core story of Ragnarok. It really did a great job of that, just summarizing the key aspects of the story, the key characters, what happens. And then the second one really gets into interpretation, and that generated a lot of discussion about different aspects of the story and so on. And maybe we'll come to some of the more controversial conclusions you came to later in the stream. But I think hmm, what I'm going to suggest is that we just do our promotions now while everybody's here, and then we'll get into it. So, is there any? We've mentioned your YouTube channel. Is there anything you would like to promote about your? Oh,
There is. I'm in production now on a documentary called Avant Garde. That's the working title for it now. And
mhm.
it's all about meeting with and discovering artists and influencers and thinkers who are reconciling with the challenges we have in modernity. I think, you know, people view that in different ways, but there's certainly a meaning crisis. There's a crisis of purpose. People see that people are fundamentally dissatisfied with life, both on a culture level and on a spiritual level. And people are responding to that in lots of different ways. So it's all about finding who some of the people are who are on the cutting edge of intellectual thought and artistic responses to this. So people basically figure out, all right, kind of our mainstream institutions aren't giving us answers to the crisis of meaning we have now. They're not leading us towards a path that's fulfilling. So what are the responses to that? I have a trailer for it up on my YouTube channel where I explain it better. Also, there's a bunch of stuff about it on my X account, NordHugr. I would recommend, checking that out. NordHugr.com. Also, I've all the information on there. But I would say definitely look into that. See if it's something that has an appeal to you. If you feel compelled to donate to the production, that would be huge because that will enable me to travel around more. I was just in Europe earlier this month and shot some content for it. Shot a couple interviews out there. Been shooting some content here in the States. Depending on how fundraising goes, I may, the goal is to go back to Europe again and film a bunch more
Mhm.
content later in like August, September. But depending on how, the financial side of that goes, might scale it down to a smaller level if we don't quite reach that amount. But there's really a growing movement of artists, thinkers, influencers kind of in this space, in the circles we travel in, who are putting forward some really interesting ideas. But mainstream institutions, even mainstream conservative or right of center institutions, rarely cover these ideas and rarely give airtime to some of the really most cutting edge and interesting people that are, creating content that's all about and creating art and ideas that are all about, responding and creating solutions to the challenges of our time. So that's essentially the goal of the documentary, is to, at a
Mm.
higher level, shed light on it so people don't have to sit through like 4 or 5 hour live stream and dig through all that just to find some of these really interesting ideas and figures. So that's the documentary in a nutshell. So please go check out nordhugr.com. Go check out my X account where I have more info on that. But that does it for the shilling on my portion. I won't shill the doc anymore today. I'll save that for another time.
No, that's fantastic, and it is a really exciting project. I was watching the trailer. I've seen it a couple of times. The production value is so good. Like it
Thank
just
you. Thank you.
it looks fantastic.
I'm working
This
on a
is
budget. So I mean,
yeah.
I'm hoping to hire another cinematographer to assist on the project. But
Mhm.
yeah, I've been certainly trying to bring in the best that I can do with the resources that I have and the tools that I have at my disposal at the moment.
Well, no, I think as well, just what you've described is really it's a great kind of premise for a documentary. As you say, that many of these ideas are not being kind of put out there in the mainstream. And even if they are, it's like they're abstracted from their context. We don't get to hear them from the original source. It's mediated through various journalists or cultural critics and ends up very tame or not
Yeah,
really what it's meant to be. Whereas this is going to be almost like condensing all these different ideas and thinkers into one place where you can just hear them and allow for that conversation to kind of bring forth new ideas and new conversations. That's
exactly.
that's really good, and it also, we want to grow in creativity, in pushing the boundaries in different areas, and as far as I'm aware, this is going to be one of the first attempts at something like this. So an exciting step forward. We're all kind of moving beyond just streaming on YouTube to
That's the
doing
goal.
doing
Yeah,
things like this. Yeah.
let's take some of the interesting things that we discuss here that you might hear on Nathan's channel or on, related channels that you find here on YouTube or you
I
find in
know
some like
nobody listens to other channels. They just listen to mine here.
that's true. I don't mean to insist otherwise. Uh and like, so many interesting ideas and thinkers are stuck on Twitter or they're stuck in some obscure forum. Let's get these out. Let's present these to a broader audience in a way that's engaging and like captures the people behind them.
Awesome, awesome. So with that, let's get into Ragnarok, and maybe there is a little connection with maybe where we're going to start here, because when you come to look at this tale, what you discover is it's not actually a single tale. It's not like a novel. It's not like there's one story, maybe like Homer's Iliad. This is actually a number of sources that we've got here. Could you
Yeah.
say something about that?
Yeah, I'm trying to rack my brain as to what all the different sources are. There are archaeological sources, There are some rune stones that have depictions of events that line up with the stories and depictions of events and figures and monsters that are in Voluspa. Voluspa is the primary text, but it's also referenced. Where else is it referenced? I mentioned in the video where else it's referenced, because there are allusions to it. The Gylfaginning alludes to some of the events of Ragnarok, but Voluspa is definitely the core story that we have records of. Yeah, so here's a great example. So this people think this may be Vidar or this may be Odin. Yeah, we have a guy with a spear with, or I'm pretty sure that's supposed to be the Fenris wolf. That's supposed to be Fenrir, but it also kind of looks vaguely serpentine, especially with the forked tongue. So there's some, when you're looking at any of these things, it's like, okay, well, what are we actually looking at here? I think, especially when we talk about things as being pagan or pagan belief systems or pre-Christian, especially when you talk about it as another, referring to something as another religion, the idea that people get in their heads when we think about this is, oh, this means, just like we have the Bible and Islam has, what are the Islamic texts?
The Quran.
They have the Quran. They have their the Hadiths.
Yeah.
They have their core canon of books that have been decided upon. And if you go outside of that, that's heresy. But they have their canon. It's been decided upon. We have the Nicene councils. The canon of what is considered in the religious texts and what is apocryphal, what is outside of that. That's pretty clear cut. Maybe there are things that are determined as being part of the core canon and things that are maybe a little bit on the outside or the fringes. I guess it does get messy in Christianity when you look into it, because the Catholics have their set of texts. You could also say, oh, the Book of Enoch, is that, technically part of Scripture? Most Christians would say, that's a gray area. That's maybe a little bit on the outside. But you do have at least a certain core set, the Gospels. Those are agreed upon. It's like, okay, that's the core set. That's like a core set of New Testament canon. And yeah, again, in Islam, and you have like Sunni and Shia. I'm not totally sure what their differences are in terms of what literature they consider to be canon, but by and large, you still have core sets of canons for most of these, especially the Abrahamic religions. And then we're viewing it from from kind of a Christian cultural background. So when we look at this stuff, we're like, okay, well, what does it say? We can say, okay, well, the Bible says in 1 John chapter 13, verse 3, that, this is what we're supposed to do. But when it comes to something that's like, quote unquote, paganism, it's like, okay, is this mythology? Is this a historical text? Is this, a story that was told for entertainment, but it was also written down by Christians who may have Christianized it in the process? Or is this just like a particular folk practice and folk legend or folk belief particular to a certain village that has remained in that village for thousands of years, and it's particular to those people and their way of experiencing, spiritual or religious or mythological practices? It's like a lot of that is very much up in the air, because there's not a core, especially, if you're talking about Greek or Roman paganism, or like Irish Celtic paganism, where you're talking about like Slavic or Norse. It's like, okay, is there a council? Is there a core church? It's like, not really. It's its own thing. It's its own, and maybe you can talk about that. But I think there's a tendency to kind of look at this stuff and try to think of it as like, oh, this is like a rival to Christianity, when it's like, it's not even really a religion, quote unquote, with a core doctrine, a core set of 10 commandments or an equivalent to that, and a core set of texts that all share the same weight and have to be interpreted in the same way.
I think that's a really excellent kind of presentation of maybe the differences between kind of your mainline Abrahamic faiths and with the Norse situation in particular.
Like
And
it's a
perhaps,
body of literature and a body of archaeology.
see, I think there's even a distinction there as well, because
Yeah.
when you say a body of literature, when you look at the Greeks, for example, you've got Hesiod writing the Theogony, is it? And so giving a very detailed account of, or actually two versions of creation stories and so on, the Pandora's box and so on. This is a written account by somebody who was present there at the time and talking about the maybe general beliefs or folk beliefs or stories that he's compiled into one place. These stories are by and large transmitted from Christian medieval authors writing probably several hundred years after they would have been part of the culture that the Norse culture. So that is a complicating factor. There's a degree of abstraction from the original cultural context for these tales, at least in the literature. And in part, that's because it was Northern Europe, Western European peoples were by and large oral societies, and they didn't write down their mythology or folk tales. That's why, for example, we have very little Britain, Celtic Britain mythology, because they didn't write any of it down. We have to look at Irish or Norse to kind of infer things about the British or the Britons. So that's also part of the the difficulty with actually engaging with what is the story of Ragnarok. But I think you're right that rather than seeing it as one tale, you seeing it as a growing tradition that moves through time, that takes different courses depending upon the day and age that it's the author or bard is addressing, can help us to understand that this is a fluid set of stories,
Yes. Yeah.
and that we don't have to necessarily pin it down to, okay, this is the official version of Ragnarok. Actually, it's I'll give you maybe a comparison is helpful here. I remember watching a documentary about Homer's Iliad, one of the great masterworks of civilization, Western civilization. And they interviewed this Oxford professor about it, and he was saying Homer probably didn't invent all of the stuff in the Iliad. There is evidence to suggest that many of these things belonged in other tales prior to the Iliad. But his genius was not only bringing things together, but doing so in a way which brought out its nobility and grandeur and the fundamentals of human life. And we can maybe see this with the development of the Ragnarok story, that it's not just a set of isolated tales, it's tales which enter into conversation with each other, and maybe different authors or thinkers bring out different aspects of that story through time, and that's why it's lasted so long in a way, or it continues to capture our imaginations, because it is a source which is able to do that.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think too the other point that needs to be addressed is what is considered pagan, what is considered not pagan. Pagan is famously a word that largely just means like outsider, or it means like from the countryside who still
Right.
practices like old kind of rural folk beliefs, still
Mm.
kind of believes the old rural folk traditions. And it's like, okay, when we call something pagan or not pagan, like let's, if we're talking about what, how do I put this clearly? I was talking to someone else about this because I think it's frustrating that what we get today, and this is maybe complicated a bit by the sort of neo-pagan movement, is that anything which is pre-official Christianization, anything which is basically what would it be, 600 in England, and pre 900 to 1100 in Scandinavia, anything that's before that is considered pagan, and anything that's like after that is like Christian. But it's like, well, so much of what we're talking about is not explicitly a pagan or a Christian thing. It's like it's just expressions of culture, it's expressions of our aesthetics, our sort of natural practices and ways of being in the world that are universal across time, that are universal across um, whatever the religion is. It's like, are runes pagan? Maybe not. Maybe they're just kind of a cultural expression that is independent from the religious beliefs. Okay, are long ships pagan? Well, they had it. They were integral within certain practices, religious and spiritual practices that we would look back on and say are pagan. But they're also an essential part of just who we were and how we behaved in the world.
Hmm.
So a lot of things sort of get the banner of pagan, which is, I think, a misuse of the word. I mean, do you see that sort of effect applied? Because that seems to be, this sort of title gets thrown out, and then I think a lot of the sort of neo pagans say, okay, now all this stuff, anything older than 1,000 years ago, we get dibs on. This is ours. Or Christians say like, oh, castles, like, oh, well, that's Christianity, and castles are Christianity now, so pagans don't get the castles. So it's like, well, isn't that stuff's related? It's affected by our religious and spiritual practices, and it is integral to those elements. But it's also something that's independent. It's an expression just of our nature and our histories.
Yeah, I think you make a great point there, and it's tricky because whenever you're looking back, you're addressing the issues of your own day, and so if somebody's wanting to be a pagan today, of course, there's different meanings of what that is, and it's sometimes quite hard to pin that down. But if we're going to take the strongest view, returning to some of these Norse traditions, let's say, or a Dionysian cult or something like that, Apollonian as well. There's some people who want to be Apollonians, right? It's trying to, in some ways, find a form which is abstracted from the following history, which is seen as to blame for many of the ills which happen, and so Christianity gets the blame for that often too. I do think there are some key differences in value system, and that might be something to talk about. We'll see. But what's often done, and I think lots of sides do this, is there's a temptation to see Christianity as thoroughly different from Indo-European religion more broadly. And it has its own category, perhaps because of its scriptural emphasis and its institutional kind of structures that develop and its ties to the Roman Empire, and also because as time progresses and you have the conversion of the Saxons and the Franks, there is like a part of the combat with the Norse is down these pagan Christian lines, or at least it's presented in these ways by scribes, and even Charlemagne kind of phrases it in that way. So you have a kind of dualism forming, which helps to unite the sides against each other. So I think there's historical reasons for it, but I think it states the case too far, because ultimately Christianity is by definition an Indo-European religion, and it's maybe one branch of that, and maybe Norse paganism is another branch of that, and there are going to be crossover and overlaps and parts which are just even removed from that conversation. So you mentioned the longships. There may be some connections in terms of the values which led to those men wanting vessels that could cross the ocean and so on to go on raids and whatnot. But it's not like the actual invention of that is determined by some, by whether you worship Odin or Christ. That doesn't follow, right? So yeah, I think you make a really a good strong point there.
I guess I just want to separate. There are, again, this is where everything affects everything else, but there are things which are, if you look back at the the aesthetics, the materials, the culture, the music, the ways in which the English lived for the last, for the entirety of the history of the English, going back to the Angles and the Saxons. It's like there are things, I think, to say that those things are distinctly Christian or pagan, those cultural expressions, those cultural artifacts. I think that's mistaken. I think it's more important to say it's like that is English, and then the spiritual beliefs of the people at any given time affects that outward expression, or it adds another layer to it. But ultimately, it's like the cultural artifacts are primarily an expression of the people themselves.
That's interesting.
And I don't want to totally divorce the people from their spiritual practice, because those things again are inseparable too on another level.
One,
But it's
and
like
certainly,
in a Spenglerian view, though, it's like it's still the same organism. It's just at different life stages.
yeah. So this is the idea that a people has a certain spirit or world feeling, right? That's what he would call it, a way that emerges from them,
The Newman.
but it also directs them, you might say, as well.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
it shapes their fundamental engagement with the world. So maybe the most famous version of this would be the Faustian man of Western modernity, who is always seeking extension, wants to traverse space. So Captain Kirk, going where no man has gone before, and the Star Trek Enterprise. That's the kind of spirit of the Faustian civilization. We're naturally drawn towards that kind of behavior for Spengler. At least you could say that from before. I don't know if the current age is like that, but
Well,
certainly
Spengler has a sentence on this.
Yeah.
You're bringing this up, and I happen to have it like right here on my screen, which is from Volume 1 of Form and Actuality. What is this? Page 349 on the PDF that I have says, so it also was that the old northern races in whose primitive souls the Faustian was already awakening, discovered in their gray dawn the art of sailing the seas, which emancipated them.
that's it. He's got a beautiful way with words, I
Man,
think.
his prose are unbeatable.
But actually that connects to what we were just saying about the longboats being built, because if you've got this vision of, we don't just want to settle here, but we have a yearning to go across and find this new land, maybe to explore it, maybe to conquer it, you're going to want to build ships to do that, and
Yeah.
better ships, more efficient ships. Whereas the Greek or the Roman civilization, I don't think it's as strong with the Roman, but with the Greek civilizations, there's a sense of inner perfection already within it, that we don't need to have anything added to it. Our civilization is perfect. Our gods are perfect. Our temples are perfect in their architecture and so on. So, although the Athenians have a navy, they're not going to try and conquer the rest of Europe with it. It's not in
Yeah.
their spirit. It's not their nature to do so. So yeah, I can see what you're saying there, and I think if you look at like the history of Christianity as well, just to kind of buttress this point, there's this theologian, church historian, Andrew Walls. He was quite influential in the 20th century, and he made this point that Christianity translates or adapts to the people who are converted. So it goes through various phases, and it changes with when the barbarians are converted. It becomes a much more communal religion, for example, than it was in the Roman Empire. We might see again when communities in Africa are converted. It's not the same as when it's in Western countries today. So Christianity has this kind of aspect to it throughout history, and so perhaps that supports what you're saying here, in terms of it kind of blends with the spirit of the people to create a new thing, perhaps, or a new synthesis or so on. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm just finding. Yeah, I mean, there's another passage right after that that basically says where Spengler's basically saying what you're saying about
Mm,
the difference with the Greeks versus the Norse, but also the Spaniards and the Portuguese. He
mm.
says, while the Spaniards and the Portuguese were possessed by the adventure craving for the uncharted distances and for everything unknown and dangerous, the Greeks went carefully, point by point, on the known tracks of the Phoenicians, the Carthaginians, and the Etruscans, and their curiosity in no wise extended to what lay beyond the Pillars of Hercules and the Isthmus of Suez, easily accessible as both were to them. Excuse me, he goes on and he says, uh, even when the lands that we call Morocco and Portugal had become Roman provinces, no Atlantic voyaging ensued, and the Canaries remained forgotten. Apollonian man felt the Columbus longing as little as he felt the Copernican. So there's
Hmm.
so I guess that kind of brings the point. It's like there's a spiritual element to that, but it's also, I guess, to settle finally the sort of pagan Christian dichotomy. It's like I think the better way to view this, instead of viewing these as forces which divide a culture in half, and everything pre this is one culture and everything before this is another. It's like these are the same. It's the same culture. It's the same organism, but it's at different life stages and at different sort of stages of spiritual commitment and expression. So it's
Mm.
committed and expressing one set of spiritual values, and then as it matures and grows and develops in different ways, then I think this is particular with the Christianization. Then it reaches a different life stage, but it's still the same. It's the same organism.
So, with that, let's turn then to maybe what the stories of Ragnarok and Norse mythology maybe tell us about the Norse spirit, and also I would suggest the Saxon spirit, because much of the mythology and the stories are shared with the Germanic and the Scandinavians, right?
Yeah.
And maybe a good place to start is Odin, because so last year, as you took part in, and many of you will know, I ran a Wagner Day where we did lots of streams on Richard Wagner, who himself engaged very strongly and creatively with the story of Ragnarok in his Ring Cycle. I had a guest on, Colin Cleary, really interesting discussion of Wagner's adaptation of these tales, and he suggested that Odin is a Faustian man. He's the archetypal Faustian man, at least in Wagner's telling of the story. He's somebody who is constantly searching for knowledge. This is something which characterizes Faustian man, that exploration. He wants to learn more. He's willing to give up his eye for wisdom. He's willing to sacrifice himself upon the world ash tree for 9 days and 9 nights to gain the secret of the runes. He's constantly wandering in many of the tales. He's going out seeking conversations with others so he can learn the future, learn what's going to happen. But he's also a conqueror, right? He kills with his brothers. He kills the primordial giant Ymir with his body. He uses the corpse to fashion the earth, fashion the kind of cosmos, just like many kind of Indo-European warrior god stories, and then becomes the ruler of that domain, and is a constant kind of battle with the giants and other monsters to protect and expand that territory, including, for example, exploiting the giants into creating a giant wall for him to mark off his boundaries. Why the giants agree to this, I'll never know. Terrible idea. Letting your enemy have a great wall. It's like Trump trying to get the Mexicans to build the wall, right? It's not going to happen. But somehow he manages it. But yeah, so there's these kind of aspects to Odin which maybe correlate with the Faustian man.
Yeah. I think Odin's a great starting point. He's one of the most multi-dimensional characters within Western canon. He's someone who has so many aspects to him, but there is always this restlessness to him.
Hmm.
This the Spenglerian phrase would be the sort of dark yearning for the boundless, that that you see manifested in him. And what's interesting is Carlyle, in his essay on Odin, where he's talking about heroes and hero worship, he has a whole essay on Odin, which is really interesting. He, and Carlyle is Scottish. Was he ethnically Scottish as well as being
That's
born there?
right.
Okay, yeah, and it's interesting too because he sort of views, or at least in the way that he writes about Odin, refers to him as a progenitor, largely. He kind of includes himself. He seems to kind of include the Scots within being under this blanket of being still within the shadow of Odin, being under, and again, you guys, you have kind of separate history with the Gaelic tradition there, but certainly Carlyle seems to identify very closely with Odin and with the Odinic, and draws a connection there. And maybe that's something. Maybe that speaks to a deeper connection. That even though there's a bit of a separate genealogy between the Northern Germanic and the Gaelic, we're still North Sea peoples, and we're still from a very similar part of the world. It's kind of amazing just looking at Scotland. It's like, a lot of that kind of looks like a lot of Norway. It's very hilly, very rough. When I was just in Norway recently, I didn't appreciate how far north Scotland was until I realized I'm like, oh, a lot of this is north of Oslo. A lot of this is, you go up north and it's a while before you actually get above Scotland. So it's like so much of it is just directly west. I guess in the camera it's opposite. So a lot of it's directly west. And yeah, you can see that certainly the effects of living in those very similar conditions, facing the same people, you get a certain amount of cultural crossover, some amount of genetic crossover too, that there is this, it breeds a similar type of man, you might say. And you can't totally separate the Germanic and the Celtic or the Gaelic. Do you agree with that assessment, or do you think Carlyle is correct in that or hitting on that?
I think there is a lot of overlap. Yes, and I think you're right that the environment does play a factor here. Evola talks about this in relation to mountain climbing. Wagner talks about it actually as well in terms of the origin of the Germanic spirit, and more broadly the Northern spirit, because he sees the English and Germanic is very similar.
Yeah.
Which is that. So say you live in a temperate climate, you're quite comfortable. You don't need to kind of wrestle with the weather too much. You don't face too much suffering as a consequence. Your food is pretty abundant. You can have a pretty chill life. But if you're in the northern climes, the weather is horrid. It's cold. It's dark. It's a struggle to get food, especially if you're doing agriculture. You really have to work hard to make sure that you have a food supply.
Yeah.
It's a life of suffering. It's a life which confronts mortality all the time, and it builds a resoluteness. It builds an acquaintance with death, and thus it becomes the base, and that becomes the basis for the artistic spirit and the cultural spirit in many ways of these northern cultures. And so I think, and a kind of wrestling with tragedy, and I think that's something which is shot through with the idea of Ragnarok. But you also see it in the legends of something like King Arthur, for example. Of course, with Arthur, it doesn't end with a permanent, glorious, 1,000-year rule of Arthur. It ends in tragedy when his nephew betrays him and tries to usurp the throne. So there's a similarity of things come to a disastrous end, and it's bound to happen.
And I imagine there's not a whole lot of easily agrible land in, a lot of Scotland seems like it'd be rough farming. Is that
a lot of it's only possible for sheep farming, really?
Yeah. Because I was, if you're gonna say, the Danes let's say the Danes and the Norwegians are in very they're part of the same ethnic group, but they're very different landscapes that they live in.
Mm,
Much swampier. The summers are hot. The winters are still cold in Denmark, but it's very different terrain from, say, whereas like southwest Norway is, at least from what I've seen of Scotland. I haven't been to Scotland yet, so I can't compare directly. But from what I've seen of southwest Norway to the pictures people have shown me uh, of much of Scotland at the same latitude, it's it looks very comparable.
mm.
So I just found that to be kind of interesting. You could maybe get this kind of parallel development due to similar conditions. But I don't want to get too hung up on there. I know I've been doing so much rambling about things adjacent to Ragnarok.
Well, just before we kind of move on from that, I think there is maybe another connection, which is that Scotland, at least north of Edinburgh, there's a kind of line in the middle of the country where there's two what would you call them, estuaries on either side of the country, the Forth and the Clyde, and Edinburgh and Glasgow are roughly in a line with each other in the middle of Scotland, and so that part all belonged to the Britons, the original Britons or Briton tribes, and so was ethnically and culturally similar to the tribes who lived in England before the Saxons came, right? And then north of that, you find your Pictish tribes. Now, the genetic Pict could apply to anybody above Hadrian's Wall. That's one of the problems here. But generally speaking, ethnically, linguistically, they're different beyond the wall, the Antonine Wall, which is roughly where I've described the middle. And this gets seen as like a land of danger, a land
Mm.
where supernatural beings like giants and witches and goblins and dragons live. And
Do you think, is that a big part of where JR or what's his name? Martin got his idea for the ice wall in Game of Thrones, because a lot of that is kind of English origins. Like, is Hadrian's Wall, is there a connection between that and you have the Northerners up top,
mhm,
the barbarians coming down against the wall?
yeah, I think that's right. Yeah, I think it's indisputable, especially as in 367 there's a massive barbarian conspiracy, as it's called, where most of the tribes come down and just start
Mm,
pillaging over the other side of the wall, right? So there is this idea, well, there's this historical event of the tribes coming. And what do we find in Game of Thrones? Aren't the tribes all united under
yeah.
Mance
They,
Rayder, and they
yep.
come to break through? So it sounds a bit similar. But you also have this kind of mythical connection of what's beyond the wall, beyond the realms of men and civilization, lie these dark forces which seek to destroy humanity, and that's shared with the Saxons. It's shared with the Norse worldview, I think, as well.
Hmm.
These on there is the hearth, there is the hall, there's the fort. These places which are safe, they mirror Odin's Asgard with
Yep.
Valhalla. This hearth that he's built, where warriors come and feast and drink and fight and so on. And it's a golden kind of place to live. There's eternal youth and much merriment and good things. There's order in the world, but beyond there is other realms, Jotunheim and Muspelheim and all these places where there are beings who wish to overturn the current order that Odin has established.
The edge
Uh,
of the map. That's where, there be
yeah.
dragons. There'd be
Hmm.
strange creatures about at the, when you sail a little too far, or you venture a little too
Hmm.
far. It's kind of the same cosmology as the the way Destiny, in the video game Destiny, you have
Yeah.
like the traveler, that's kind of like, and you have the tower, and that's like your mead hall, that's your village. And then you
Mm.
get further out, and the adventurers go further out, and things get stranger and stranger, and you're fighting the darkness. It's always encroaching on the
Mm.
hall, and it's kind of the same. That's like the sci-fi version of that.
Well, no. What's interesting about this is that it kind of gets to the heart of a key difference between Greek/classical
Mm.
mythology
Hmm.
and Norse and Christian mythology, actually. Insofar, and this is Tolkien's interpretation of it. For the Norse and Christian, there's a dualistic worldview going on here. You have, broadly speaking, the gods led by Odin, who is the High King of the gods, with the heroes of men up against monsters and giants and so on. And these two sides are in a perpetual battle, which will climax with Ragnarok. This characterizes Saxon literature as well. So a poem like Beowulf, what do you have? Beowulf, this great man, he's not just fighting anything, he's fighting a troll or a monster called Grendel, who is identified as a son of Cain. Cain is cursed by God. He is because of his murder of his brother Abel. So this is a clear identification. This guy's on the side. Grendel's on the side of the devil. He's an enemy of God. That's who Beowulf is fighting. If you contrast that with the classical world, take Odysseus. So he takes on the Cyclops. So a similar sort of character, right? But the Cyclops is not against the gods. He himself is the son of Poseidon. And while the gods may fight with each other and disagree with each other, such as in the Siege of Troy, different gods take different sides, it's not like there is, in general, a threat to the reign of the gods. It's not like there is one side, a bunch of monsters who are perpetually at war with the gods. There's maybe one exception in the character of Typhon, but generally speaking, that isn't the character of classical mythology. Whereas in Norse mythology, that is very much it. And I think that idea is reflective also of the environment, the sense of a hostile world, a hostile place beyond the territory we can establish, beyond the domesticated places we and Odin have built. That's how you've got to think about it.
Yeah, the idea of the hall, I think that's a central theme in both leading up to Ragnarok and after Ragnarok. So you have Valhall, you have the Hall of Valor, which I believe that's the etymological root. But you have Valhall, where you have the warriors who've been selected by Odin. And he's gathering all these forces unto himself. He's gathering the heroes, as you alluded to, bring them into himself, and the hall is kind of this rallying point. It's this place of preparation and battle and merriment and morale formation. But then after all of this is destroyed in Ragnarok, what comes after Ragnarok in Voluspa is a new hall. It's a new king in a new hall, and this hall, what is considered the sort of vision of the next world has the hall at the center. It has this is the center point, and what is, I don't know if we should consider this, we were kind of talking about this before the stream, as to it's a little bit ambiguous as to, is this the beginning of a new age with its own rise and fall, or is this a sort of final stage that's the sort of like heavenly stage, or is there still strife in this world? We don't really know exactly, and maybe you want to touch on that more. But I think what's interesting is that the Germanic view is like the end times. What's within how do I put this? Within the end of Norse cosmology, what orders everything correctly is having a righteous king in a hall at the center. And it's like this hall of light at the center. And that is the properly ordered world.
Yeah, I think that's a beautiful way to put it. And I mean, that's a very old idea, right? So the idea of the king being bound up with the fate of a people, and insofar as they are a bridge between the divine and the mundane, between the sacred and earth, the often taking up this kind of priestly role, them having a good leader, therefore, builds that bridge. And if the hearth or the hall is the place where that's located and kind of radiates out, then that's almost the image
Yeah.
within this period.
And it's
And
no it,
fire is quite interesting in that regard as well, because fire is often connected with the sacred in this regard. So the king who tends the hearth is the one who is keeping the fire of the civilization going. The one who lets it die, the civilization dies. So there's a strong kind of symbolism there.
Yeah, it's not named in the Voluspa who this righteous king is. So, and again, this is kind of where this is a part of it which particularly seems like there may be Christian influence within it. Again, I don't want to it's easy to sort of say that because maybe it's too fantastical to believe that there are these really profound parallels between pre-Christian and Christian mythology and beliefs that maybe we don't want to let ourselves believe that actually these things are more seamless than we're told. But it's who's this king? Is this Odin? Does Odin somehow manage to survive, or is this king someone else, or is this king? I think it's left ambiguous because it's like the unnamed god in Greece. It's like this, Paul comes in and he's like, you have a statue to an unnamed god. Or, you come in the Norse version and you say, okay, you have a righteous king who's coming after Ragnarok. That's Christ.
I think it might be worth just reading the stanzas here, just so people know what we're talking about. And I'm also going to preface this because I realize we're almost starting at the end here of Ragnarok. So I'm just going to summarize very briefly, because I realize we haven't actually said what Ragnarok broadly involves. So
I apologize. I knew it'd be crazy.
don't worry. So basically, we've been talking about this conflict between the gods and the giants. Essentially, this comes to a climax after 3 years of Fimbulwinter, where the world is kind of turned into snow. Nothing's growing. Think about the weather connections we've already been talking about. The moral order collapses and political order because the brothers are fighting each other. Kinship is broken. Everybody's killing each other. But then the giants and the monsters come forth to face the gods in a final battle, and many on both sides are killed. Odin, as has been prophesied in many of the poems, is killed by Fenrir the wolf, who is also the beast which seeks to devour the sun, which again is very interesting kind of connections there. Thor is killed after slaying the world serpent, that which actually keeps the world in place. So the slaying of this is kind of the end of the order in a way. And other gods are killed as well. But eventually the earth is brought under the waves. First the world is soaked in fire, you might say, by Sutur, the fire giant. Then it descends into the depths. But then a new earth arises from the depths, and this is what is described. Now do I see... Oh, this is from the Volupsa. Now do I see the earth anew, rise all green from the waves again. The cataracts fall, the eagle flies, and fish he catches beneath the cliffs. The gods in Itherfall meet together, of the terrible girdler of earth they talk. Is that the world serpent, do you think? The terrible girdler of the earth?
I mean, you think of the world serpent is kind of this it is girding the bounds, so that's my assumption.
And the mighty past they call to mind, and the ancient runes of the ruler of the gods. So that sounds like Odin, that they're reminiscing about Odin, who discovered the secret of the runes, as we mentioned earlier. In wondrous beauty once again shall the golden tables stand mid the grass, which the gods had owned in the days of old. Then fields unsowed bear ripened fruit. All ills grow better, and Baldur comes back. Balder and Hoth dwell in Hrop's battle hall. And the mighty gods, would you know yet more? Then Hrungnir wins the prophetic wand, and the sons of the brothers of Tvegi abide in Vindheim now. Would you know yet more? More fair than the sun, a hall I see, roofed with gold, on Gimli it stands. There shall the righteous rulers dwell, and happiness ever there shall they have. There comes on high all power to hold, a mighty lord, all lands he rules. From below the dragon dark comes forth, NordHugr flying from beneath a fjol. The bodies of men on his wings he bears, the serpent bright, but now must I sink. Da, da, da. Yes, so that references the hall that you were talking about there, in terms of
Yeah,
this beautiful golden
brighter than the
hall.
sun. It's a hall of light and gold.
Mhm.
It's, you know, Revelation has this description of um, this new kingdom with God at the center, and it's this, you know, city where it's light radiating out of it and water
Mm.
of life pouring from it. And it's this kind of similarly evocative image, although this has a very distinctly a distinct cultural expression, a distinct aesthetic expression that is more in line with our histories.
I think as well the reference to fruit, that this, so that they haven't even tilled the land, but it just bears fruit.
Yeah,
This is again very similar to Revelation in terms of the ideas of all the faithful will be satisfied at the throne of God. Um, you have promises of lands of milk and honey and so on, but here as well, it's like the toils that we have to wrestle with in this world, with the weather, um, with the earth. They're gone because the earth is abundant now. It's giving all of its goodness, free of hand. In a way,
yeah,
though, you could see this as like a counter to Pandora's box, in a sense, because in Hesiod's tale, and maybe this is too much of a thing to connect, but in Hesiod's tale, or different versions of the tale, Prometheus steals the fire and gives it to to mankind, because there are only men at this point, and the men have been living off golden apples which the gods have given them. Right, so it's a bit like this state. But
yeah,
then, as a kind of punishment, and also as a limitation to stop men from being a threat to the gods, Zeus punishes them by giving them a woman, Pandora, who opens this vessel which lets out suffering, plague, evil, and death. And man will have to work the land to make his way now that he has the fire. So they lose this golden age, but perhaps you could see it as this is allows men to actually become men and exercise their agency. They're no longer children. But here
yeah.
we've got a return back to a state where that's gone, and the fruit of the land is just available once more.
I think that that may be the correct connection. Although if you bring it back to Pandora's box with Eden, and then you could see this new hall is more like the new kingdom or the new restoration of Eden
Hmm.
after. So in the
Oh, that's
Pandora, it's like the timelines are kind of, you gotta switch the timelines a little bit, and then I think it clicks a bit better there.
well, and
So
also just say with Eden, you have the curse of Adam and Eve following taking the fruit from the forbidden tree. And what is Adam cursed to do? He's
cursed to
cursed
till
to
the land.
till the land, right? And that's how he's going to get his food. He's not going to get it just immediately from the trees anymore. So that does seem like a genuine connection, especially as in is it the Volupsa, or it might be the Vathruad Nismal, I want to say. Um, there's mention of uh, the human race being born again, as it were, from two humans who come from a
Yeah.
wood, which
So
is
so you
connected
have
to the original story of the creation of humanity as well, right? So,
yeah, so you start with Ask and Embla, and then you have who are the new Leaf and Leaf Thressier.
That's right, yeah.
So you start with there is kind of this rebirth of humanity after. Although Leaf and Leaf Thressier, I believe, they've survived the Fimbulwinter.
They've been hidden in a forest,
Yeah,
which is interesting. Given that the original humans were drawn from the ash tree, is that right?
Yep.
So you've got
Ash and Elm. Ask is
right.
Ash and Embla is Elm.
Oh, okay, yeah. So you have this connection of the new birth of humanity connected with the trees, which is connected with fertility. There's this kind of you just mentioned it rhymes. It rhymes.
It's like poetry. It's like poetry, folks. I had to get that joke in there.
It's great, but it is literally poetry as well, so we can say that. But but yeah, so you can see that, and I think it's worth saying as well. Many of these writers or the bards and so on, like we're connecting it with classical mythology and biblical mythology. Many of them had heard these tales before.
Yeah.
Like people have said about Beowulf, for example, there's clear evidence that the author was inspired by Virgil's Aeneid. Like within the text, you can trace bits which look very similar to the Aeneid. So many of these people were quite well aware of the great stories across Europe. So it shouldn't be a surprise, therefore, if things cross over or there's similar motifs or being built into their own cosmology and so on. It doesn't mean that it's a kind of imposition or something like that. It's actually, as you were saying earlier, that it's a creative response to it.
I think the historian's temptation is to look at this as a corruption of the text, whereas perhaps the literary or maybe the grand, the small historian is looking at like, okay, what does this tell us about the times and the places and the people? But maybe the grand historian, the Spenglerian historian, is what does this say about the spirit of the people as it evolves through time and as it matures, and how is this the completion, this sort of inwardly manifested completion of the inner feeling, or the I'd have to find some of the actual passages in Decline of the West, but Spengler is always he's always trying to pull from, he's looking at, okay, he's treating cultures and peoples as living beings who are going through these sort of natural processes of development and change as they go through their early life and they mature and they change, and these are expressions out of that. So I think it's like, this is almost, you could see this as a project, a European project of completing all these different literary elements and mythological elements that have been building in the background for thousands of years, and then drawing them together into a more complete form.
Yeah, I think that's true, and I think it's why it's such an enduring set of stories, right? That these ones appeal because they're contributing to that. Oh, he's dead. Matt's lying. Can you still hear me, Matt?
Sorry, am I back?
You are back. Yes. You're quite loud though. Oh, he's died. He's completely died. Well, that's. Oh, here we go. Let's see. Hello. Yes, you're back.
Shoot. Sorry, I don't know if you can hear me, but I can't hear. I lost my audio. I physically disconnected.
You were just so excited. Oh, okay, well, we'll keep going. I think one thing that so we've been talking about this mighty lord in the Volupsa, and can you hear it now? Right.
Yeah, I think we're good.
Yes, we're back now. So
apologies.
What I was just going to say about the so the mighty lord in the Volupsa, that in that text it's not clear who that's going to be. right? That's what you've been saying. But in this Vathruth Nismal, which is another poem in the Poetic Edda, and we don't know if it's by the same person or a different author. I have no idea. But it is suggested there who the ruler might be, because Odin, he's in a kind of game of wits with this giant, Vafthrûdnir, who's supposed to be like the wisest of the giants, and whoever wins gets to kill the other one. So there's a lot at stake, right? And you've got to answer honestly, and if you can't answer, then you lose the game. And Odin's doing this in part because he's a bit of a trickster. He wants to challenge himself. He loves the contest. He loves the fight, which is again a very kind of Norse, northern kind of aspect. I think the Drengir, the character who wants a fair fight, and the fight itself is worth it even if you lose. And Odin's got that here. And he asks this giant. Who will rule the realm of the gods after the fires of Surt have resided? So after Ragnarok, who's going to rule? Vafthrûdnir replies, in the gods' home, Vidar and Vali shall live when the fires of Surt have resided. Modi and Magni will have Mjolnir after Thor falls in battle. So there's a clear kind of, it doesn't say it explicitly, but I think it's pretty implicit. Modi and Magni take over from Thor as in his role, but Vidar and Vali are going to follow their father and take up that role. And it's especially appropriate as Vidar is the one who slays Fenrir, who is the killer of Odin. So there's a
picks up his father's spear.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Actually, I'm trying to. Does he actually pick up? Does he pick up Gungnir when he slays Fafnir? I'll have to double check that.
Yeah. But yeah, so he
he slays him with the sword. That's right.
Okay.
Because Vidar has his own sword because he drives it into the hilt. It's mentioned explicitly. He drives it into the hilt. So I was just my imagination was just kind of running with this on my own, but now I'm remembering how it actually goes.
This sounded like a kind of Lord of the Rings-esque, like takes up his father's sword.
Yeah, that's where my brain was running with it.
But I mean, even those ideas are kind of similar to this, right? It's like take up Isildur's sword and fight Sauron. Like he failed, but you can go and kill him, right? So it's similar ideas. It's you are fulfilled in your descendant, or in a way, your descendant is an image of you, perhaps the perfect version of you. And producing such a descendant is actually one of the goals of life. Whereas today we don't think like that at all. We don't think that we are represented by our those who come afterwards.
No, that's a great point. And yeah, because that's one of the central themes of the Ragnarok story is it's a series of things that are becoming with sort of the natural order or the proper spiritual orders becoming frayed and going astray. So there's kinslaying, there is various lusts that people are, adultery is basically becoming rife. People are cheating one another. It's becoming bonds of kinship are being frayed. So it's certain things that you could look to and say, well, in a civilization where it's reaching its end or where it's in a state of moral decline, such as a lot of what we see around us, it's very easy to see parallels and be like, wow, we've really lost. Adultery is more widely accepted or more prevalent. Bonds of kinship have become, have basically frayed. We're all atomized now and disconnected. These sorts of disconnects from the proper order of how we're supposed to live. And it's like, these are what herald Ragnarok. Ragnarok, it's like, is Ragnarok inevitable? It's like, I don't know. It is human failings, is, falling away from living in accordance with how we ought to. Is that inevitable? It's like seems like it, but maybe there's still an element of human choice in the matter.
That's interesting. I haven't come across that kind of view before, but you're right that there's a definite falling away of humans from the order of Odin, or the way of the world that he has established. But do they have a choice in the matter? I guess.
I guess depends on what level of predestiny you think they believe in. Certainly, I think I'm inclined to think that there's a certain amount of human decision making in the matter. Maybe, and it's how much if your fate is decided by the norns, or if you're a Calvinist and your fate is predestined.
Yeah.
Does that mean that the rest, like all the other decisions you make in your life leading up to your death, are those also predetermined and woven in the threads of fate before, without any of your agency? It's like, I don't know.
Well, this is an interesting question, because the poems that we've been discussing, they come from the point of view. So the Volupsa is this kind of seeress, has been conjured by Odin, and he's asking her what's happened, what is happening, and what's going to happen. And so he's asking her for a vision of the future, basically. In the Vafthrudnismal, Odin again is in this game of wits where neither side are allowed to lie. And actually, you can only ask the questions if you know the answer as well. So he already knows many of these things are going to happen. So it's implied that there is a strong view of fate in the very kind of meta level of the poem. But it's always left open because it hasn't happened. It's not happened yet. So there's always a chance that maybe that's wrong, or it could be averted, or something along the way isn't there. So I think you're right that because the poems themselves are looking to the future, it's never, although there is an element of fate included there. So, for example, Odin's going to be killed by Fenrir. Well, that's yet to happen. So until it happens, we'll never know for sure if that's what's going to happen.
Yeah, Odin certainly, it seems to be the one figure in Germanic mythology that believes that the fates can be overcome. That he's like, not me though. Not me though. I'm built different. I'm gonna find a way. I'm gonna find a way around it. I wanted to touch on more how, what is the significance of the gods? What is the significance of just all these figures of mythology for any given nation? Like, why should we study these people? Or these figures or characters, however you view them, whatever they are. I don't entirely know myself what they even are, as far as, are these like archetypes? Are these historical figures of greatness that have been, I don't really have a clear answer to any of this, but I think it's important to see, certainly Carlyle has his ideas as to the origins of some of these figures. Snorri has his thoughts on the matter. I want to read a little bit about what Carlyle writes on his essay on Odin. One of the paragraphs near the end, he puts, he writes, how the man Odin came to be considered a god, the chief god. That surely is the question which nobody would wish to dogmatize upon. I have said his people knew no limits to their admiration of him. They had as yet no scale to measure admiration by. Fancy your own generous heart's love of some greatest man expanding till it transcended all bounds, till it filled and overflowed the whole field of your thoughts. Or what if this man Odin, since a great deep soul with the afflatus, I've never heard of this word before, and mysterious tide of vision and impulse rushing on him, he knows not whence, is ever an enigma, a kind of terror and wonder to himself, should have felt that perhaps he was divine, that he was some effluence of the Wutan movement, supreme power and divinity, of whom this rapt vision, all nature, was the awful flame image. So what he's saying here is basically this sort of natural tendency that humans have for hero worship, to adore a hero, to adore a great man, pour their love and admiration into someone. That, our ancestors would have done this with a figure like Odin, and Odin looks to himself and says and thinks, perhaps I am actually this great divine being. Perhaps I actually am a god of sorts. And so he pulls this into himself, kind of like in Warhammer. If you believe in something, if you believe in one of these chaos gods, or you believe in the emperor, it actually sends them energy, and they actually manifest those qualities. So it's something almost kind of Warhammer-esque here. And he says, he says, where am I going? So that he was some effluence of the Wutan, the movement, the supreme power and divinity, of whom to his rapt vision all nature was the awful flame image. That some effluence of Wutan, of movement, dwelt here in him. He was not necessarily false. He was but mistaken, speaking the truest he knew. A great soul, any sincere soul, knows not what he is, alternates between the highest height and the lowest depth, can of all things the least measure himself. What others take him for, and what he guesses that he may be, these two items strangely act on one another, help to determine one another, with all men reverently admiring him, with his own wild soul full of noble ardors and affections, of whirlwind chaotic darkness and glorious new light, a divine universe bursting all into godlike beauty round him, and no man to whom the like ever had befallen. What could he think himself to be? Wutan, all men answered, Wutan.
It's such a great passage. It's so powerful. I think I was thinking about this earlier, actually, just in preparation for the stream, and I was reminded of a passage from the Havamal poem. So again, another poem from the Poetic Edda. And this stanza has to do with when Odin is on the tree. He's sacrificing himself, may have gone through death to get the secret of the runes. And he says the following: "Wounded, I hung on a windswept gallows for 9 long nights, pierced by a spear, pledged to Odin, offered myself to myself. The wisest know not from whence spring the roots of that ancient rood." That's a really interesting line, myself to myself. How do you tease that out? The poem itself doesn't necessarily go further than that, but it may point to something like what you've just recounted from Thomas Carlyle, that this is some man, or let's say some being, who has some sense that in his exploration for knowledge that he's connected to something else beyond himself, that he's not just sacrificing to himself as an individual. And I think as well of the Odinic spirit. You've mentioned, that it's frenzy, it's ecstasy, it's the source of poetic wisdom, and so on. What is like an ecstatic experience? It's a dissolution of boundaries. It's a dissolution of self, and a sense of losing yourself in something beyond yourself. Within the Berserker, that turns into blind fury. And of course, the Berserkers, they were identified particularly with Odin. But it can also be a sense of unity with reality. I mean, that's how Nietzsche understood the Dionysian kind of impulse. And interesting, Dionysus connects both unity with all things and suffering. And we're thinking again of kind of Odin's significance in Ragnarok. But it seems to me that there's maybe this kind of idea here then, and that he is in some sense aware that he's connected to the very fabric of things, or the deep things of the world, of reality, maybe a spirit. And if that's so, and this is me just being a bit speculative now, perhaps this helps him to accept Ragnarok as a possibility.
That he is a primal force of the order of the universe.
Mm-hmm. And that actually, if Ragnarok is fated or part of this primal process, and he as an individual must die so that the new world can be born, then that allows him to embrace that reality. That he's going to fight, but he's not trying. So, like at Ragnarok, he fights, but is he trying to avert it? Because he's been foretold this is going to happen.
I think there's also Sorry.
I was just going to give you a contrasting example here, and I should say as well, if you take that sort of logic, then perhaps like his son Vidar taking over, well, Vidar himself might be part of that, like participates in that reality too, at a very deep level. But the contrasting example would actually be from Dark Souls. So Gwyn, the Lord of Light, is very much like Odin. He slays a bunch of dragons and establishes his world, the Age of Fire. And, there's this glorious kingdom of Anor Londo and so on. But then the world begins to fade, the fire is going out. And naturally, it should pass into an Age of Darkness. But rather than face the Age of Darkness head on, he sacrifices himself to relight the flame, and thus brings into being an unnatural state, which has all sorts of terrible consequences, like humans can't die anymore and so on. Now, okay, that's a certain view of the story. I appreciate there'll be others who disagree, but that's not like Odin. Odin isn't trying to fight. Well, maybe he is in some versions, but it doesn't seem like he's trying to deceive his way out of Ragnarok, if the prophecies are true.
I just had the clouds opened, the light parted in. I just had a connection here because I've been trying to think for a while. I mean, Odin is such a kind of a unique character that's like, okay, are there really any clear parallels to him in fiction, or in the fantasy genre? And it's hard to find. It's like, oh, this is clearly an Odin-like character, unless it's someone literally just playing Odin. But then I realized, I was thinking back, because I just watched Dune Part 2 this weekend, and I was thinking about, I'm like, oh, Paul Atreides, he starts out, he fits much more in the Carlylean idea of how someone goes from being someone who is a significant figure, maybe a great man of history, to being this godlike figure, to being a god, so to speak. Because Paul Atreides, when he becomes Paul Muad'Dib Atreides, he takes on this mantle. It is partly his own rising to power through his own efforts, but it's also, there's this religious fervor, there's this natural hero worship among the what do you call them, the people who he lives with on Arrakis, the Arakians, the northern and the southern tribes of Arrakis. They are seeking the Lisan al-Gaib. They're seeking this messianic figure. They're seeking a god, essentially, of sorts. And they will this into being for him. They manifest this yearning for a leader, for a messiah, for a figure like this into him. And he, Paul Atreides, after a while, adopts this, and it sort of becomes a gray line of like, okay, he's not, this is a prophecy that is manufactured, or it was planted artificially, you could say, but he wills it into being a true prophecy through choosing to accept this to become the Lisan al-Gaib. As written, he chooses to accept and embody this. And then he also, to drink the water of life, he sacrifices himself to gain this knowledge so that he can ascend to this higher level and accept his destiny as this hero, sort of godlike figure on Arrakis, and then overthrows the Emperor. So, the spoilers, but it's been out for a while. But I was like, oh, there's finally a connection in fiction that actually parallels some of these stories and some of these archetypes. There's also a Christian connection too. You can look at it in a lot of ways, but that's the closest I've seen recently where there is an Odinic figure that
That's
actually
interesting.
follows some of the same paths.
And not one that would immediately come to mind given the context, but yeah, I think you make a very compelling case that that's been brought into that kind of science fiction, but also desert world.
Yeah, very different environment. It's aesthetically contrasting.
But I guess the desert also has that harsh reality, right? It's not somewhere which is comfortable. It's not somewhere where you can get by easily. And there's a lot of wandering in the desert as well. I'll add that, and that's obviously a key part of Odin, is he wanders the world a lot. But yeah, that's a really good comparison there. You should write an article about it or do another video on it.
I'm thinking about it.
Prussian Blue says, "Is it the Fremen?"
The Fremen. That's it. Thank you. It escaped me for a moment there.
I guess one thing we haven't really spoken about, but it's been kind of in the background, is the kind of attitude Odin displays at Ragnarok. Is well, it seems to be emblematic of a certain attitude that was strongly cultivated and celebrated amongst northwestern European peoples at that time. Tolkien calls it northern heroic courage. It's this kind of standing up against a foe which you know will defeat you, or at the very least is like 99.9% is going to kill you, but you fight on anyway. You stand resolved. You're not refuted by losing the fight. If you give your all, it's worth it. And Tolkien kind of clarifies this a bit as well. In his view, it's not just that. For like a soldier, it's actually purer because they're doing it out of love for their lord or out of obedience. So there's a kind of, oh, this is my orders. I know it's hopeless, but I'm going to keep on fighting anyway. Which, given he was in World War I, fought at the Battle of the Somme, that's quite a sobering thought when you think about it in his own life. Like, okay, I'm going to have to go out into these terrible fields of killing where there's shelling and gas and machine gun fire and so on, but I've got to go anyway because that's my duty. So that's that northern courage. Whereas for the leaders, it can often stray into pride and a search for glory, which I think the Norse and the Saxon might have celebrated, but Tolkien himself is critical of in certain situations. And you see that in The Lord of the Rings with the character of somebody like Boromir, who he wants to take the ring in part because he wants to be the one that saves the world. He wants the glory of that. It's not just about saving Gondor. It's he has to save Gondor. Beowulf, he could take like 10 men with him to fight the dragon, but it'd be more glorious if he kills the dragon alone. So he dismisses his guard and goes alone. And eventually, although his nephew does disobey his orders, and that's a good thing, he is himself killed in the end. Spoilers again, but I think Beowulf is 1,500 1,000 years old. If you've not caught up with it yet, there's no hope for you. But yeah, so like there is this strong idea.
One of your ancestors has heard it before, so yeah, you can't be spoiled.
It's within your psyche at some point.
Yeah,
cultural memory. But so at Ragnarok, not only Odin but the Einherjar, the men who are heroes who Odin has chosen to join him at Valhalla, who have been. But the way they get there is actually they die in battle, right? So they're already going through this northern heroic courage, you might say.
Yeah.
They really display this at Ragnarok because they too will know that they're going to lose. They know they're all going to die, but nonetheless they're going to give the monsters one hell of a fight before they go out, and that is kind of the creed of the northern people.
Yeah, I think. There's two ways I want to run with this. So if you don't mind, I'll just kind of throw some crazy stuff out there, and we'll see what sticks. And then I'm curious what you think of this. So I think Jung can provide a little bit. Now you know we're going crazy. We're bringing Jung in. I think Jung's idea of the collective unconscious is very interesting to this because I think it connects. Carlyle has this idea that Odin casts his shadow, his ways of being play out throughout history, and this is something that extends beyond him to his people throughout history. It's what does he write? He says, "Is not that Scandinavian mythology in some sort the portraiture of this man Odin? The gigantic image of his natural face, legible or not legible here, expanded and confused in that manner. No great man lives in vain. The history of the world is but the biography of great men." So there's this idea that like great men of history, heroes, the gods, essentially, this is played out and manifested in the people, in their people, particular to whichever hero we're talking about. And it also comes to this idea that, if certain gods or if Odin is a part of the collective unconscious, this idea that, within the minds of all people or within sort of the cultural movements, there is this, certain traits are manifested and, people react to sort of broader organisms that instead of just being individuals, there's this sort of higher intelligence, higher consciousness that emerges out of large groups of people that, Odin is a manifestation. Odin is part of this collective unconscious and that Odin can manifest, or this Odinic spirit can manifest in certain ways at certain times. So connecting to that, how do I pull this up next? I'm actually losing my train of thought. So we were starting with what was the last thing we were talking about? We're talking about okay, I got it.
Courage, right? Okay.
All right, I've got it. So if that's true, then Odin manifests this idea, and actually the whole of Northern Courage is about this. Northern Courage is this sort of Odinic collective unconscious manifestation, you could say, that it's embodied in the Einhard, but it's embodied just throughout. It's ingrained deeply in the culture and in the history. And what that comes to is there's this unwillingness to accept history as such, or history as it just plays out, that it's something that can be played out. And although there is integral in Germanic belief this idea of the fates, that things are fated and that we are bound to them, there's also simultaneously there's this tension with the Odinic. So there's this kind of acceptance of death and this embrace of death on one hand, but there's this also refusal to die easily, and it's this refusal to go quietly into the night. To it's instead we're going to rage against the dying of the night, and so it's this. How does that play out in history? It's like Odin is a man. It's like he refuses to just go out into history. And in a sense, the Odinic peoples, it's like his people, I think, have this kind of refusal to just go out into history. Like, is that going to manifest in the collective unconscious as this sort of, you think of like every people, every tribe in history. It's like, well, everyone's kind of descended from someone, but also, you have this inevitable rises and falls of civilization. You think of like some ancient tribe you read of in the Bible, or you read of in an ancient text. You read of the Sumerians, or you read of the Hittites, or you read of pick the Scythians. Pick your group. It's like these have all passed into history, no matter how great they were. They have all died off at some point or changed in a way that's like very different to what they are now. But I think within the Odinic, there's this idea. It's like, no, we refuse to accept this. We will remain forever. We will do whatever it takes to remain to the end and beyond the end. And I don't know if that's going to manifest in a strange way with the Germanics, the sort of idea that the Germanics don't want to ever go out in history. And maybe that manifested in a very destructive way in the last century. But maybe that's still around. I don't know. I'm trying to think if there are other groups. Certainly not many groups want to die out in history. Not many groups want to accept that there's this. If you look
Right.
at things on the 10,000 year, 100,000 year time scale, that maybe we won't be around, or maybe we won't exist. Maybe our culture, maybe our group will cease to exist in the next 1,000 or 10,000 years. But I think there's something about the Odinic. It's that desire that's like, no, we don't want to ever die out ever, and we don't want to ever. Or if we're faced with that, we're going to fight that to the bitter end.
There was a comment by Wolfish Naturalist, which I thought really corresponded to what you were saying. Odin comes to lend a helping hand to Iceland's most famous and long-lived outlaw, Grettir Asmundarson. Due to his intense northern courage, fighting many men alone, Odin steps in. And that's from the saga of Grettir the Strong. So you have this kind of connection to what you're talking about here. Of it manifests in the different heroes, right, or the peoples. It comes through in their stories, and Odin is tied to that very strongly in that story, right? That he, the very having of northern courage almost summons Odin, in a way as a force. But that's suggesting that the two are intrinsically connected.
Like Odin is kind of the Odinic spirit is actually just our spirit. It's not that it's, and if you are to believe, say, Snorri's idea that Odin is like this progenitor king from Troy, or I guess Thor was from Troy and then Odin after him. But if you are to believe that, and that we are actually descended from Odin, that actually because we're his descendants, we carry those qualities, we carry those character traits, and that these mythological stories, these show how that manifests and what those are. It's like that is northern courage, that is never wanting to submit, although that's certainly never submit to like an adversary. Right. I guess that changes with Christ. There's the submission to Christ, but never wanting to submit to an adversary, at least. And there's this always striving for the infinite, striving for Faustian exploration, striving to even get through death, get through the inevitable destruction and falls of civilization.
I think it's and I think that's right, because the extension of life infinitely, you could say, is part of the Faustian mantra, right? So
that's a good point.
But death is the limiting factor there, and can you ever break it? That's the question. So
what's his name? Something Johnson on Twitter. The Don't Die guy. Do you know who I'm talking about?
No.
He's a guy who's like obsessed with trying to live as long as he can. Some people call him Moonbra.
Right. Okay.
Because he's like kind of this lunar energy as opposed to like Soulbra. It's all about the sun. This guy's like kind of vampire mode. He's like taking all these weird hormones and doing all this like intense multi-million-dollar a year just to try to extend his life longer. It's like that's pretty Faustian right there. That's pretty pretty Odinic. You would say.
It is, but I want to qualify it as well. Because I think what you see with Odin and these cultures is that they want to confront death head on.
That's the
I think that's the snake. Like the jaw, often in the paintings. Let's see if I can bring up some of these paintings. It's almost like the jaws of Fenrir or the jaws of Yogmundur, the world serpent, are closing in on the warrior that they're fighting, and yet they charge in nonetheless. This is a good one, actually. Here we go. Like, this is the presentation of it. And so Odin's not running away to try and do this. And he's not, when it's the appointed time, he goes head on. He gives everything. And I think that's another aspect of this. They're fully embraced in the battle that they're going to have. So men like Beowulf, he fights Grendel without weapons because he says it will be fairer to Grendel because he doesn't have weapons of his own. Now, this turns out to work out well. He's rewarded for this because it turns out weapons can't pierce Grendel's skin. But Beowulf didn't know that before he fought him. He just believes in a proper fight. And so, in a sense, he's giving everything and he expects everything back. And if Grendel wins, that's fine. Grendel wins. And I feel it's almost the same with Odin and all of these Norse and Saxon and Germanic characters. It's like, okay, we want to resist, we want to overcome these things, but we're gonna go full on with it, and we're gonna give everything, and we'll enjoy it if we win, and we'll enjoy the fight nonetheless. And if we lose, well, that's okay, because the fight itself is important. Whereas this guy that you're talking about, in a way, it's like he's
Brian Johnson.
Brian Johnson. It's like he's trying to run away from that fight. He isn't taking death head on, in a sense. He's trying to flee.
Yeah, he's trying, because Odin and the gods and the Einhar ride out to meet death. They ride out to meet monsters. Whereas, like, I think the Brian Johnson model, the don't die model, is like, I'm gonna just try to get on a boat and paddle away. And if I am really good at paddling away, maybe I'll survive like 10 minutes longer.
Right. So that's quite a different idea. It's more like Captain Ahab going out to find Moby Dick, and that's the image I always have as well of, like, this is the guy you were talking about, right?
Yep, Moonbrow, right here.
Don't die. You know, he seeks out Moby Dick to have a confrontation with him, and he's going to get crushed. Like, this is a huge whale, but there's always just that abiding image of him holding the spear. Again, the spear is quite interesting as a weapon of choice. I guess it's like a harpoon spear, but
same thing
to kill this massive beast, and he's absolutely crushed by it. But that's that kind of possession to keep fighting and to take on death and live on that edge. And in a way, it corresponds again to the Dionysian, or it's a different answer, because there's this story of Dionysius where there's this king who finds him in a wood. I can't remember the names, I'm sorry. Nietzsche mentions it in The Birth of Tragedy. Go and read it there if you want the full version. But he keeps pestering him, like, oh, tell me what the meaning of life is. And he's like, no, I don't want to tell you, because it'll destroy you. You're not ready for it. It's like, no, tell me. It's like, okay, but you're going to regret it. It would have been better if you'd never been born, which is absolutely savage, right? But the point is like, this life is full of suffering. There isn't much good to be gained from it. It's awful. People are awful to each other. Nature's awful to us. Better that you had never lived, or just get drunk all the time like Dionysius, right? But the Norse answer is different. It doesn't say that. It doesn't say it would have been better to have been dead. Rather, it's better to have lived and fought your hardest and then died.
Yeah.
And that's Odin, that is Odin's attitude at Ragnarok.
Yeah, I think as a Christian, it's useful to understand this stuff too, because I think studying these myths is studying our own nature, our own qualities. It's like, okay, what are our natural inclinations and tendencies over the last, like 10,000 years? It's like, well, this is where our most heroic qualities tend to go, as manifested in these figures and these stories. This is where our greatest vices and our greatest failings tend to go, as manifested in these stories and these tragedies and these characters. It's like, I think by studying that, there's great value in the sort of self-knowledge, or the sort of broader cultural knowledge. I want to talk a little bit too, because C.S. Lewis has a couple places where he writes about this need. He puts it in an interesting way. He talks about basically needing to re-paganize people before we can Christianize people. And he writes in one of his letters, he writes, "Certainly I feel that very grave dangers hang over us. This results from the apostasy of the great part of Europe from the Christian faith. Hence a worse state than the one we were in before we received the faith. For no one returns from Christianity to the same state he was in before Christianity, but into a worse state." And I think we can see that around us when we look at the absolute deterioration of morals and the sort of Christian, taking certain Christian roots and then perverting them in strange ways. this idea of sort of Christian love or Christian acceptance, you could say, and then twisting that in very malicious, harmful ways. He goes on to say, the difference between a pagan and an apostate is the difference between an unmarried woman and an adulteress. For faith perfects nature, but faith lost corrupts nature. Therefore, many men of our time have lost not only the supernatural light, but also the natural light, which pagans possessed. But God, who is the God of mercies, even now has not altogether cast off the human race. We must not despair. And among us, not an inconsiderable number are now returning to the faith. So much for the present situation. About remedies to the question is more difficult. For my part, I believe we ought to work not only at spreading the gospel, but also at a certain preparation for the gospel. It's necessary to recall many to the law of nature before we talk about God. Now that's interesting. You don't normally hear that as much. It's necessary to recall many to the law of nature before we talk about God. For Christ promises forgiveness of sins, but what is that to those who, since they do not know the law of nature, do not even know that they've sinned? Moral relativity is the enemy we have to overcome before we tackle atheism. I would almost dare to say, first, let us make the younger generation good pagans, and afterward, let us make them Christians. What do you make of this?
I'm just imagining C.S. Lewis accounts on Twitter, like suddenly going full heathen and, trying to convert everybody to New Age paganism.
Step 1, convert to paganism. Step 2, win. Step 2, victory.
Yeah, that's interesting. To be honest, I'd need to think more about that because that's quite a bombshell. Like I hadn't heard Lewis say that before, or but I think what I would say to that is that, and this might address something that Wolfish Naturalist says in the chat about he enjoys our respect for Germanic heathenism, but finds it baffling at the same time, and but it's like Tolkien's, right? And I think that's the thing. Like to me, these traditions are not wholly incompatible. I think there's parts where there is disagreement. I think there are parts where if you were you can see them in a competitive relationship, and at points there's going to be things that you have to say, okay, for example, do you believe that Jesus rose from the dead? That's a pretty decisive issue, right? But in terms of the way Europe developed, the way that Christendom developed, think of the medieval era. There's a fusion of these values. There's a fusion of these aesthetics. There's a fusion of mythologies. There's a fusion in so many ways that when you read the stories of King Arthur, for example, you find all of these things crossing together in ways which are not in competition. Or there may be some tensions, but they're there together. And I see, for example, like Merlin. Merlin's a very Odinic character. He wanders the woods, guiding people, searching for knowledge, and so on. Arthur the bear. Does that not sound a bit like Beowulf the bear? So there's these characters who seem to map across. And so when you say this sort of thing, I think, well, actually, I would much prefer folks would be pagan and kind of in that tradition than have totally repudiated it, which is what the modern world does. It's more, I see more continuity. I see that we inhabit the same community more than I do many people today. What do you think of that?
Yeah, no, I think you're on point with that. It reminds me of I had a conversation a few weeks back again when I was in Norway. I met with made a new friend out there for the first time, and we were visiting a stave church. We were exploring it.
Yeah, I saw it in the trailer. I put it in the trailer because it's really cool. And we're exploring around the grounds of it and talking about it. And he's someone who
isn't a Christian, but had kind of grown up around the faith more.
Mhm.
And we were talking about, he just kind of felt disconnected from Christianity. And a big part of that we were talking about, and he's like, what it kind of came down to after we talked through this for a while was that there was this disconnect between, he's like, when you talk about Christianity, or when you talk about our history and Christianity together, it's like I kind of get it more. I kind of have this more of this respect for it, because a lot of it came down to the way in which Christianity is expressed, or the particularism within expressions of Christianity. And what we find now is, a lot of the time within Christianity, and maybe this is more of an American thing, but there's this belief that we can have Christianity with no context.
Yeah.
We can have decontextualized Christianity. We'd have Christianity that exists in a void of culture, that exists in a void of aesthetic expression, a void of musical expression, a void, something that's like, what's the most mass market music we can put out that's as simple to appeal to the broadest possible audience? What's a way we can present Christianity in a way that is not as particular to like the culture of the people around it, the aesthetic expression? It's like, it's not rooted in a particular culture or particular place. So perhaps the Midwest version of this would be like, okay, how do we have like a barn Christianity or something, or have, I don't know. There's ways you could do it. That's a bad example, but because we were at the Stave Church, and he's like, I would want to worship here. I would want to worship at this Stave Church. It's like, this feels natural. This is like, this spiritually connects me to God more, being at a place like this versus at a church that's like, has no cultural roots to it, or no, like, that's ungrounded or unrooted. It's like, I think Christianity works best when it's not trying to replace and evaporate the existing culture and sit on just dry pavement. It's like, it's best when it's rooted in soil and it's manifested in the particular ways that resonate with a particular people. So you can look at, say, Eastern Christianity as exists in Eastern Orthodox. It's expressed in a very particular way. You can look at Ethiopia. You can look at how it's expressed there. It's like, it has this very unique flavor to it. It has this very unique aesthetic and ritual expression. You can look at it in Italy. It has its own very different culture and flavor to it. You can see it in the North. Again, Stave Church is kind of a prime example of this. And the Stave churches themselves are so interesting because they're this extreme, no compromise architectural expression. Everything is like harsh, jagged, pointed up. It's wood. There's a hyper intricacy to it. There's this driving upward. It's like, if you put
it's Gothic.
It's extremely Gothic in the most like wood natural sense.
Let me see if I can get a picture of it.
Yeah. It's just being around it. It's like, oh, I get it. And I think that's been a challenge for Christianity lately. I'm not trying to like start. Yeah. So that's a good example. I think that's the Bogrun Stave Church there, but it's kind of like, I don't even know. It's like, there's nothing else like it.
No, it's very distinctive.
It's very distinctive. And I think that's part of why it works so well.
Yeah,
again, there's no aesthetic compromise there.
It's the spirit of a people manifested in wood and stone, right?
Yeah.
It works itself out, and you see that in Britain with the stone churches that go back 1,000 years. It's the same principle, and they stand and they have a different aura to them than the buildings you walk past every day, which are boring concrete or glass or something like that. No, these have a certain effect upon you.
Yeah.
Straight away. I would go as far as to say that it's almost like a certain spirit engages with you when you see a building like that. And it's different depending on the culture and the form as well, isn't it? So this building will have a different, it will reach into you in a different way than a stone cathedral like Westminster Abbey will.
Yes. Yeah.
Or the Ethiopian churches will, which go back many centuries as well. I would say the same thing is true also of paganism in a different way, though, in that if you look at kind of popular paganism, let's call it, it's a grab bag of new age ideas with a little bit of this and a little bit of that thrown in together. And you see it all the time. It becomes a very kind of pick and mix approach to religion. Whereas actually, when I think of like the guys in our sphere, that's not what they're looking for or seeking to practice. It's much more rooted in traditions and into kind of being rooted in those texts and so on, with the aesthetics that are appropriate to that. But in the popular culture, when you say pagan, it can mean a lot of different things which are loosely drawn into a kind of consumerism. So I think both Christianity and paganism are wrestling with that difficulty today.
Oh yeah, and I don't want to say that, you know, well, if we just made our churches nice, or if we just fixed XYZ, we'd save the West and we'd be back, and you know everything would be perfect, and everyone would just see the light and come to Jesus, and it'd be awesome. You know, I don't think it would work quite that simple. I don't want to pretend like there's, you know, easy solutions to all this, but I think C.S. Lewis, because he writes more about this, he has another letter where he talks about some of these ideas, and I think he identified, at least when it comes to this thread of thought, he was onto this way before. I mean, I wasn't even born yet when he wrote this, so he was like way in advance. He writes here, and I think a lot of that just comes down to, it's like we need to, you know, C.S. Lewis talks about getting back to the natural law, and then, you know, we need to build up from like the foundations, and that's kind of what's been stripped out. It's like the foundations in which all of this is rooted, all of the context in which Christianity can take soil, that topsoil has been stripped away, and it's just like bare concrete. It's like that's hard to grow faith. It's hard to grow anything higher without that soil. And some of this, so yeah, I'll just read what he wrote here. So
is it a long passage? We're kind of running over time here, actually.
Kind of. Sorry. Maybe we'll save it for another time.
Let's save it for another time.
Yeah.
Because I think this is a topic which, I mean, I want to do this again because I think there's so many other topics connected to this that we've touched on, but we could discuss more. We have a couple of super chats, so I thought we could answer those questions. So Cinder Mountain Studio for $5. Thank you very much. Could it be said that Ragnarok is an age similar to the Iron Age in Hesiod's idea of the 5 ages, a time of great turmoil and conflict? What do you think?
Well, I would sort of answer that question with a question, which is also, is apocalypse an age? Because people have very different ideas about when the end times take place. Are we in, you know, a lot of Christians believe, I believe the Catholics believe that we have been in the end times since Christ's return to heaven, since his ascension. Whereas a lot of evangelicals believe that, you know, we still have the rapture. We have all the events, all the eschatological events are yet to come to pass. And the other Christian perspective is basically these events are an ongoing thing. The events of the end times are ongoing. And it could be that, it could be that Ragnarok. Now, I think there's something very cosmological about Ragnarok. It's a reshaping of the whole order, the whole cosmology. Although you could also say that, at least for the gods themselves, Ragnarok already took place. The gods basically did die in terms of the culture. Like they died like they're no longer worshipped to a large extent. And they have been replaced by, or at least for a while, they were replaced by a new righteous king who reigns in this hall of light. So they were replaced by Christ. They were replaced by a new order in a new cosmology. And this did occur for them mythologically speaking and religiously speaking. but I think there's layers to it. I think you can look at it on the mythological and religious layer. You can look at it in terms of civilizations. So you could say the civilizations that Germanics and Northern Europeans live in, maybe we are facing or will be facing a Ragnarok that's of our own, or Ragnarok, or some sort of end times of our own. Perhaps we're heading towards that now. Or you could also look at it as like this ties into a global, a sort of apocalypse or end times or Ragnarok that affects the whole world. And this is like the true like 10,000 foot view end times for everyone.
Well, and you can see it in terms of Spengler's civilizational cycles, right, of seasons. Yeah. So he has this idea that a civilization in its infancy is in its spring, and it's got a lot of vitality and growth taking place. Then it reaches its zenith in the summer, starts to fade in its autumn, and then in its winter, it is dying or dead. Basically, it's very sterile and static, and things are decaying. And you could see Ragnarok as maybe mapping on to that age of winter, certainly with references to Fimbulwinter, for example, this period of 3 years of...
Talk about a parallel.
But then there is a very cataclysmic ending, and it is a great battle. This isn't something that's just going to whimper out. It's a massive fight. So there is a danger of maybe applying it too closely. But if we see it as symbolic, I guess, or representational of deep things going on, then I think you could see it in that light as well. But yeah, I think that you gave a very good response to the question there. We've got one further question here. Thank you again, Cinderman Studio. Ben Wheeler for $10. Thank you very much, sir. Support and hype for King Arthur Day. Thank you very much. King Arthur Day will be the 27th of May now. It's not the 18th, it's the 27th. It's had to change. I'll tell you more about that in the future. I wrote a story called Last Man Standing at Ragnarok, which is about a mother finding an alternate version of her son who fought through Ragnarok and escaped. That sounds pretty interesting. And again, taps into some of these ideas we've been discussing about, standing your ground and fighting. So how did this guy escape? Was that the right thing to do? But also what happens after Ragnarok, what kind of fates there are, and so on. It sounds very interesting. If it's online, please put a link in, and we can have a read of it. We'll share it around. I'd love to read that. Yeah, it'd be good. Oh, we've got another super chat just come in. Nobody wants this stream to end. That's the reason. They don't want the Ragnarok of this stream. Terrible joke, I know. Holy Weather for $5 Australian, I believe that is. Thank you very much. From a dharmic perspective, you can say that all things are dying and being reborn constantly. Each moment is your last and your first. What do you say to that, Matt?
I think that's... I don't know... I'm not studied in dharmic tradition, so I'm not really knowledgeable on the subject, but certainly you can apply that to the life. People have their own life cycles. I'd be interested to know what it means that each moment is your last and your first. I suppose, as you pass through the day, it's maybe the last time you do something and the first time you move on to the next thing. But I think it is, there is a very personal level at which perhaps people face Ragnarok. We all are going to face our own death at some point, and coming to terms with that, how we face our own death, that's a similar experience. Whether we're dying on the field of a great battle surrounded by warriors and monsters, or whether we're dying alone just by ourselves or in a small context, it's like, well, we're still dying. And that's still a moment of, it's hard to put into words that can be a moment of extreme intensity. So we still have to face the end one way or another.
Yeah. No, I think that's well said. And I would just add to that as well. I think in ancient cosmologies, well, and metaphysics really, the human being is a microcosm of the cosmos, right? So what happens at a cosmic level happens to each of us individually and to our communities. Everything, all of these processes happen at every level. So when we get to something like Ragnarok, okay, this is something which happens on a cosmic scale, but it also happens to civilizations and communities which are on a lower level, but it also happens to individuals too. And you could see this, I think, in almost every aspect of life, the growth and death and rebirth. I think Hegelian traditions also speak to this in part.
Jonathan and Matthew Pajot, in their book
Mm.
on cosmic symbolism, do talk a lot about the sort of microcosm and macrocosm view of symbolism.
Yeah. So, yeah, I think there's some truth to that. I would need to think a bit further about it, though, into its specifics. But yeah, there's a very dynamic aspect to all of reality, which I think is why it's so engaging, and why the fact we have such a sterile view of it is so degrading to all of us. You know, if this is true, right, it's really exciting, it's really engaging, it's compelling about reality. It's not boring if you're dying and being reborn constantly, right? That, and if everything is in that process, that's exciting because there's energy, there's things happening every moment, there's creation and destruction, there's movement, there's, there you go, exactly, the spirit of Odin is everywhere. There we go. That's what we've reached the conclusion of. But thank you all for your super chats, and thank you to everybody who has watched along. Matt, is there anything you would like to promote quickly?
Just check out, just check out my Twitter at NordHugr, and you can find all this stuff about my documentary there.
Yeah, everybody should do that. It's a great, and I've put the link to your channel in the description so people can find you there. For myself, I'll be on Walrus's channel tomorrow. We'll be talking about the Black Death, a nice fun topic. Talking about the end of the world, probably was for 14th century people, but also the benefits of the Black Death. You know, gotta find those benefits. And then next week, I'm thinking of doing a stream on the Peasants' Revolt of 1381. Something that is so fascinating. Have you heard of it, Matt? The Peasants' Revolt?
I've heard of it, but I know nothing about it.
Okay, tune in next week. It's going to be great. It's like it's a great case study because it's I would argue the most significant populist movement in English history, and it's very dramatic with that. So if that's the sort of thing that you're interested in, the history, but also the political kind of implications for today, the lessons we can draw, the Peasants' Revolt is where it's at. So all that remains for me to do is to say thank you to you, Matt. You've been an absolute joy to have on. It's been a great conversation, and we'll need to do this again sooner rather than later.
Hey, thank you. It's been my pleasure.
Thanks, everyone. God bless you all. Good night.